who are those few key individual leaders and what makes them and their wiring and their role, that contribution catalytic. Hey there, guys. Welcome back to another episode of the H3X Podcast, where I, Mark Gearing, and Dave Miller, we dive into the head, the heart, and the hands of the multiplying church and our leaders. And Dave has been reading a lot of Malcolm Gladwell lately with some other friends of ours and gleaning a lot from it. And so he was bringing in some of these ideas. So a retreat we had here in New York this weekend, and we thought, man, we should dig into that a little bit more. So, Dave, can you set that up for us?
Yeah. So I'm just kind of like, hey, I want to revisit all of Malcolm Gladwell's books because I really enjoy his reading. So I just kind of went back and started all of them over again. And the one that really came to the surface was the good old book, Tipping Point. We talk about it a ton, especially in the movement world, where we're talking about even when we share with like, hey, what's the big vision? And then we start talking to people about the hard facts. One of the things that we always kind of use is that how many people have to be involved, have to be committed, have to own the core apostolic task in order for there to be a tipping point. And, you know, the going rule of thumb is about 10%. But as we were talking about that book, Tipping Point, I kind of went back to not necessarily the mathematics of it, but what are the roles? What are the people that are involved, and how do they play a part in us spreading the idea of multiplication when it comes to the kingdom of God, and you know, the methods and the models that we use for moving past addition into multiplication, which is what H3 with the X at the end is all about.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. And I like how before we hit record, you were highlighting in seeing something, a tipping point happen, and what Gladwell is framing up with that book. There's a tipping point in which things begin to go viral with people, and it's really about that idea, that information, that idea, that concept, catching for people, getting to enough people, and them taking hold of it, that the idea itself begins to take on a momentum of its own. So the tipping point math, like you said, is helpful to understand the concept, but then it really, that the next question is, so what does it take to get to that point? And that's where you're bringing in the
Absolutely.
idea of the roles to get to that viral idea.
Yeah, because here's the deal. We're not at the tipping point. We're not even close to the tipping point in North America, especially even in pockets of North America. We're further away than I would say even as a whole, maybe as a general. And so we're at the point now where we're saying, how do we get there? And I think one of the helpful pieces of that book is, you know, that one of his big issues is it's a few key people who really help to move that sticky idea forward. And so whatever it is in his particular book, the sticky idea, in our case, we're talking about the head, heart, hands of the multiplying church and her leaders, but even more generally, we're talking about multiplying the kingdom, seeing movement principles and reproduction and multiplication principles be the mode of operation for the way in which we do disciple making and church planting. And so, you know, those few key people and the roles that they play, it's really good to recognize those so that we can make sure that those roles are being fulfilled.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we use that term sometimes, the term catalyst. It's this idea of a small amount of something. If you use like a science experiment, a small amount of something that then ignites the whole rest of the experiment. Or in the parables of Jesus, where there's a little bit of leaven that's introduced and then the whole thing gets transformed. And so there's this idea of like a tiny little bit. That's what you're talking about. Is it doesn't mean that like everybody's got to do something in order to get that to change. It's actually about who are those few key individual leaders, and what makes them and their wiring and their role, that contribution catalytic, that we're kind of dialing into today.
You know, and the funny thing is, when I look back at our time, even in Oklahoma City with me, you, and Carter, in a lot of ways, all three of us played this role that we're going to walk through, but each of us kind of had our little niche on what we were doing or what we were better at. Even though generally speaking, we all tried to do these roles at all times, whenever we got together as a team or we were doing things together, we really started to find, not that we even knew that we were doing it, but we really started to find that, on a team, we kind of got specialized in what we were able to contribute when we were doing things together. Those three big roles that he has in that particular book are connectors, salesmen, and mavens. And starting off with the connector, like in biblical terms, we call the connector an evangelist, but they're the people who they know everybody, they're connected to everybody, they can move in and out of social networks very quickly. They can pepper people with the ideas. They have a way of just spreading the idea extremely fast. And there was
Yeah.
no question in Oklahoma City who had that role and who had that gift, and his name was Carter Cox.
Yeah.
Like that guy, he knew everybody knew him, and he just spread it. He's still doing it. He hasn't changed any.
Yeah.
But that connector role is the person who is able to just be a part of multiple social spheres very quickly, and they can just talk about the idea and get it out there real fast.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. What about the other two?
So the second one was a salesman. That's really the persuasive role. That's the person who's not only a connector, but they have the ability to sit down, listen to people, and then talk to them in a persuasive way that helps them see and understand the idea. It may not mean that they sell them completely to where someone goes from zero to I'm fully on board, but they have the ability to move people step by step by step by step towards that acceptance, towards that ownership of the idea. And then that third one is the mavens. They're the ones who are really the communicators, the ones who are collectors of information, and the ones who are passing it on. And what's really interesting about the relationship between these is that if you have the connector, you've got somebody who is making sure everybody hears about the idea. You've got the salesman that's helping everybody walk down the ideas. And then you have the mava who's providing the framework and the resources for that salesman to be able to use so that people can step by step by step by step see where they're going and move towards ownership at the pace that they need to go in. And the funny thing is that like the way we worked in Oklahoma City was Carter was the connector, you were the salesman, and I was the maven. Now that wasn't perfect in every regard because we all did our own version of all three of those at all times. Right. But we just had a tendency to walk that way. You're just a very persuasive guy because you're able to take it down to the street level and make the information make sense. And if somebody's asking questions, they find Mark, they'll get answers,
Yeah. But I think to your point, I appreciate that. And that is like when I saw this, I was like, yeah, I think that there's a piece of that in me for sure, that I get excited about, how to get other people on board and how to get things rolling in that. So for sure, I connect with that. But that's interesting that you were even highlighting that. That's some of what we want to talk about today was what are those roles, but then also, I think that's interesting. You're pointing to the way that we function together in Oklahoma City, because it's not just that you have those roles, but how do they function together as a team to get something started, catalyzed to get to that tipping point. And so I don't know if you want to dig more into some of those specific roles, Dave, or if we want to talk about the team. Where do you want to go from there?
Well, I mean, it's really just up to you. We can sit down and visit a little bit about, do a little bit of look back on where we were in Oklahoma City and just some of the lessons that we even learned, and then take those same lessons and say, okay, now where we are after we've kind of spread out into different areas, and then we're trying to repeat the process again. And just talk about the path forward is fine with me. But I would say two things about Oklahoma City as I look back on that time is to say, yeah, Carter tended to fall into the connector because he's very natural about that. You tended to fall into the salesman, and not in a derogatory way, but in a persuasive, beneficial way. You're just very good at that. And, I'm the egghead who wants to collect all the information and think about things and write things and talk about things. But what I would say is that you were connecting just as much as Carter was, and I was connecting just as much as Carter was. It's just we may not have been as good at it as he was, but we were still doing those things. And in multiplying disciples in churches, I mean, clearly you're collaborating and collecting information and playing the massive maven role. So you were doing the maven role as much as I was doing the maven role. And then on the flip side, there'd be times where you and I would flip flop in terms of persuasion, where you would ask me to come and talk with somebody because what you were saying wasn't connecting, and maybe what I was going to say was going to connect or we might
Yeah.
put Carter in that role. My point in saying that is that, yeah, we tended to fall into the specialist category, but on all honesty, to get it done, we were generalists in practice because we were
Yeah.
always doing all of them when it was necessary.
Yeah, I like that you highlight that. So, I mean, I think it's important to understand that we don't have to be it all, but then also maybe I would say there was a sparking of those different roles as I learned from Carter some of what he was doing, and then I would even say I see that Maven with Carter. He built this whole like tool database that continues to grow. That otherwise would just be a giant spreadsheet, except you're Carter, and so you're connecting people to it, and it's continuing to be functional and helpful. So he's done that role too of gathering the information and making it accessible to people. So yeah,
And to
but
be
then I
honest,
think
like
that's yeah. Go ahead.
well, the whole role that he's playing right now is being one massively huge creator of information in Maven, in what he's doing right now to create resources in other languages and put them in a central place where people can get to them. So, by any means, are we pigeonholing ourselves into these? No.
Yeah,
And I
good
think
point.
the real takeaway is that it takes a few key people, and those key roles are that connector, the salesman, and the Maven with a sticky idea, and those have to be constantly in use. But the people who are using them are the people who are committed to that sticky idea. They're saying, we want to see this spread.
Yeah, so maybe before we talk about team dynamics with that anymore, Dave, it's like what is it about each of those roles? Because I think that could also be helpful in this conversation of it getting to a tipping point. What is it about each of those roles? You touched on them kind of lightly, but that contributes towards that idea going viral. What is it about the connector, the Maven, the salesman?
Yeah. I mean, I'd hate to, there's so much, well, there's just so much loaded up with COVID that it might not be a great illustration to take it into the COVID world, right? Because we have so much, so much animosity built up from that year. But whenever you talk about something going viral, I mean, clearly something has to spread fast for an epidemic to take place.
Yeah.
It's got to have the ability to spread itself out in such a way that it's naturally going to go from relationship to relationship without a whole lot of having to be pushed and prodded. But there has to be a place where the concentration of it gets to the point at which it can spread exponentially. So maybe I'll put it in the financial world. Like the connector's job is to take compounding interest and make use of it. But when you first start investing, compounding interest isn't your friend, but there comes a point at which compounding interest exponentially starts to grow, your returns,
Yeah.
because you just get such a concentration of it that it starts replicating itself so fast that it just goes from barely to all of a sudden an explosion. And that connector is creating that concentration. They just got to get the idea out and talk about it.
And part of the connector that I think makes things go viral is, and it's kind of built into the word of connections between, but it's not just connections between like-minded people. They are ultimately the one that's going to bridge between somewhat close together. Or they're like different people in the room. They've got some different ideas, and they have a vision. Maybe not a vision. They just naturally just want to bring people together.
Yeah,
and they get the
right.
people. They get the people in the room, and then those ideas begin to transmit. And sometimes it's slow at first, or sometimes there's maybe that wasn't the right person, but they're just that's what they do, is they keep bringing those people into the room. And so ideas hop over into new networks or into new groups because they're bringing them together.
Well, I'd say a practical example is, if have you ever sat with somebody and you're having a conversation with them and you say something, they go, hold on, tell me about that again. And
Yeah.
then you tell them and they go, hey, I've got this friend. I need you two guys to talk. And the next thing you know,
Yes.
they're on their phone
Right.
making a little text message between you and them saying, y'all need to talk about this. This guy knows something that you need, or he knows
Yes.
something that you need, or you guys need to talk. That's a connector at work. He may not even be the one who does the conversation between the other two, but he's making sure that this idea is spreading between people and just making connections everywhere he can. And they're just people that just naturally see
Yeah.
that I know something that somebody else knows, or we need to connect. And they just do it all the
Right.
time.
Yeah, so I like that idea sometimes of the term of like the pockets. Like you can have different pockets of people where there might be a group of people that are networked together, whether it's a family or whether it's on a college campus or in a certain business sector, and they're connected, that pocket, but then they may not be connected for like for good reasons to other pockets. And so once that group of people, that pocket gets connected to another person through that, hey, you got to meet this guy. The idea can then spread throughout a whole nother sector that it might not have otherwise connected to. So that's the value of the connect.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, that connector doesn't mind going between multiple tribes. They function well being in multiple tribes without feeling like they're being unallegiant to the tribe that they're the most connected with.
Yep. So then what about the Maven? That one. What do you see as their contribution towards that going viral?
Yeah, that Maven role is crucial in the same way the connector role is crucial, but what the Maven is doing is they're taking the learnings that the community and the idea is generating. So as multiple tribes are getting involved with this Maven is hearing and he's listening and he's making sure that the information and the learnings and the ways in which this idea are connecting are getting assimilated and then distributed back out. So they're taking things. And I think one of the cool ways in which a Maven really functions inside of trying to get a movement or an idea to spread radically is that the Maven takes people's ideas and then brings them into the fold so that that person doesn't just feel like someone who's a part, but they feel like somebody who's an owner. In other words, they're saying, I contributed, and the Maven has a way of taking those contributions and giving them a place in the group that then makes them realize, oh, I'm not somebody who's on the outside looking in as a fan. I'm a part of the team, and my contributions are making a difference, and that draws them in and makes the ownership rise to the surface.
Yeah, and as you're saying that, Dave, this word came to my mind. It's almost like the Maven, they legitimize the idea to the people that might be they're kicking the tires on it. And then as that person says, okay, I think I want to be a part of this, they legitimize that person to the rest of the group, and they help it to
Perfect.
To all get connected in a way of like, no, this is it's building the DNA basically of it.
Yeah, and I love the way you're bringing in the fact that they're legitimizing as well, because at some point somebody has to create a foundation that makes the idea, like you said, legitimate. And one of the ways that an idea is legitimate is by some basic organization, some basic sharing, some basic connection of the ideas, and then talking about them and providing info at a place so people can go, oh, this is something that's not just flippant. This is not just something that's just one-off. It's not a fad. This is something that people are putting thought into, spending time on, giving their lives to. And the Maven creates the environment where they can see that this is a legitimate idea.
Yeah. And then they're also, I think, the person that's going to help with either mentoring, coaching, that's going to be kind of more of their bent leaning, so that as there are people in the community that are running up against some of those barriers for that idea to continue to spread, they're going to help with some problem solving and help that to multiply as well. So,
and you and I both know very well that if there is not that role, that if someone is a connector and then they get persuaded by someone who's a salesman and they hit that barrier and there's no one to help them with that barrier, they're out.
Right.
And they won't get to ownership.
Yep. So now we've got the connection. The things are connecting together. That Maven that's helping to legitimize and even get over barriers. But now let's talk about the salesman role in getting to this idea going viral, tipping point.
And the term salesman sometimes gets a bad rap because people assume that there's ill motives involved. But the idea of the salesman is really just to be a persuader. And, I look at the role that Paul played, where he said, I become all things to all men by some means I might persuade some, right? Like,
yeah. Oh yeah.
We're doing, it's the person who's willing to put their life in the life of another person and take the time for them to ask the hard questions, to maybe be a little critical, to give a little pushback, but they'll sit and they'll listen to them and they'll take the time to help them work through those ideas, those initial barriers that are causing them to not even consider it. That persuader is someone who's saying, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? You're doing this. How's that working for you? How have you been seeing results, or how have you been seeing expectations fulfilled in your own world? Consider what we're doing. Consider this idea. And those consideration roles is very important to get somebody to go from curiosity to engagement.
Yeah, I like the way you said that. Some on this who listens podcast who own a business or just have been connected with Donald Miller and his story brand stuff will be familiar with that concept. But I over the years have loved. I know it's a little bit of a tangent, but I've loved that story brand framework because what Donald Miller has done, look it up if you haven't heard of this. What he's done is he has helped to clarify communication that addresses core problems, external, internal, philosophical, and then provide like what are some other people in the community and how they've gotten wins or social proof, and then call people to that action piece. So anyway, that's a simple framework that he's put together that I think is a really clear way to talk about what do those persuasive skills look like to help an idea go viral, because that's the deal is it's you've got to take the connections that you've got and that information that comes from somebody who might be a maven and put it together in such a way that it addresses the barriers or the challenges to adoption that somebody might have, that you connect them with some of the social proof or like, hey, this is working here. Here's a case study here. Here's some reasons how it's starting to work here, and then call people to action. And when you put those things together, it takes that person from lack of clarity to they're in the driver's seat. They understand what the ask is. They understand what the action is. Are you going to do it? And then they step in and they begin to take action. So that salesman role in my mind is putting together the connections and the information in a way that gets more adoption.
Which, to put it in very simple terms, that salesman persuasive role is because they're the best storytellers. I mean, at the end of the day, that's the role that they're playing,
Right.
is that they're telling the stories of how things can be different in a way that's connecting with people, which is why I constantly lean back and go, Mark, you're the persuader, you're the salesman. That is like your skill set to the ninth degree, because you're a tremendous storyteller of not only the things of the scriptures, but also a good storyteller of how the scriptures come into life in your own life and ministry. And so, like even in the little group where you're sharing what's going on in New York with people who are in your prayer team and prayer partners and those kind of things, you're just constantly sharing stories. Here's a picture, here's a story, here's what's happening. And it's just constant persuasion of this works and here's why, and look at me. And so maybe in a better way to say it is that salesman, that persuasive person is going, imitate me as I'm imitating Christ in the terms of what we're talking about, right?
That's it. Yeah, that's it. So I think we touched on this just really briefly, but in a team, when you've got this, there's that 80-20 rule or 20-80 rule, where if you've got a few people that are that catalytic function and doing these core roles, it can ignite that idea going viral and others begin to do it together. And so we just touched on those three roles a little bit, but some of what, as I reflect just now briefly on that teaming together in Oklahoma City, it really did require, yes, acting as a generalist, to use your term, in other teams or other roles, but then coming together, it required me to engage in mutual submission of saying like, okay, in this team, I'm gonna defer to Dave in this way, or I'm gonna follow Carter's lead in this way. There's that mutual submission piece that if you're going to work together to see that idea go viral, you've got to be willing to allow people to bring their specialty, right?
Yeah. And one of the phrases you use a lot that we've picked up from some of those guys in the 2414 crowd is, and Guy Caskey in particular, is don't organize an it until you have an it to organize. It may have come from somebody else. That's where I heard it first. But there's this point at where we're talking about when we do get to the place where we have people who have owned it, people who have said, put their yes on the table, and we want to get more strategic and we want to get more effective in what we're doing, then the specialization starts to kind of rise to the surface, where I'm saying, hey, like what you said, we're committed to this as a team. And then we do have practice some mutual submission where we're saying, how can we fulfill a role that's going to make use of our giftings in such a way that together we do more than we could separately? And that requires me to own one of these roles if we're in this context, and be the best at it.
Yeah, I like that you brought in that quote. I didn't think about that piece of it, but you don't organize it till you have an it to organize. And so when you've got these roles helping the idea go viral, the things begin to take on a life of their own, until it hits that tipping point, and then and I mean, it's going to happen earlier than that, where it's going to begin to formalize. But it's important early on for that team to just allow things to continue to organically grow versus any one person. I guess that's the point, is like it would be easy for any one person to try to take control and to make it into a certain thing, or but you've got to be willing to see the vision as bigger than yourself, as bigger than anything you can touch or make happen, and allow it to take on the life of its own.
Right. And like what I would say is that if you get in a place to where someone realizes, hey, someone's a great connector, someone's a great salesman, and someone's a great maven, and let's say you've got 2 or 3 people in each of those roles, the goal is not to say you can only be a maven. The goal is for somebody to champion that maven role. And if other people are doing the maven role, then their job is to applaud that, to make sure it's happening, but not to be like, no, I'm the maven, you don't do that. That's a ludicrous way of approaching any type of a specialization. Is I'm the connector, you're not allowed to connect. Well, if we do that, then we've completely short-circuited the whole role of connector, which is to spread the idea as fast as possible.
Right.
So, it's one of those places where we're going, our role is just to make sure that is happening, not that I'm the one that makes it happen. There's a big difference between those two.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. So, and I think even to go back to some of our specific example, now I'm reflecting on what you're saying as we're recording this, but it's like, if we had shut one another down and in functioning in multiple of those roles, the sparks that I received from you guys would have stopped, or I would have shut you down in continuing to help that idea go viral in spheres that weren't just together. So I think, yeah, in Carter, who again, you're right, he's an amazing connector. And him not saying like, no, oh, whoa, you can't connect with that person, or you can't do that. Like I'm doing that. But in him just championing any way that I was connecting or helping to connect people together, it actually ignited more connecting happening because he did that.
Yeah, absolutely. In the same way, like, so I've got like the Citrgy website that I work on, and I go in spurts. I'm not like, I feel like I have to post something once a week. I just, whenever I have stuff, I put it up. When I don't, I don't. And whenever other people have stuff and want to make use of it, they do. But here's the thing. I've had people who have called me before and they've said, hey, I know you've got this Synergy website, but I'm interested in putting one up. I just want to kind of to know, or would you be upset about that? I'm like, why? Why would I be upset with you gathering information and providing information, even if it's duplicate of what's on Synergy? And the reason is because they are going to connect with tribes that I'll never connect with. And so the goal of Synergy is not to be the place. It is to be a place that sparks other people to create more places, because I would love to have 1,000 more synergies, because each one of those are going to be something that somebody can connect with. And it's not about who's the authority and who's not. It's about, here's the idea, here's the learnings, let's get it out to as many networks as we can possibly get it to, so that the connectors can connect and the persuaders can persuade. And then as they persuade, the closer a Maven's resource pool is. Follow me in this logic for a second. If someone's connected, and then from there, they're connected with someone who begins to persuade them, the closer a Maven's resource pool is to that persuasion, that person who's under persuasion, the closer that connection is, the more persuasive it's going to be, the more the stories are going to connect, the more they're going to believe what's going on, because they have a relational trust whenever it's multiple away. If that resource pool of the Maven that's being used is completely outside of all the tribes that they know and is something far flung, then it can be helpful. It can be a resource, but it does not carry the same amount of weight if it's somebody who's in their own city or someone who's even in their own tribe.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. Well, as we begin to wind down on this episode, I think I'm going to bring this in as a final example here, Dave. We've been working to be a contributor, a couple of contributors towards the work in reaching the unreached in diaspora in North America. And we had this conference that many of you who listen to this podcast came to, or you're aware of, last September, right? The Unreached Peoples North America. Well, out of that, one of our big goals was not to just have conference after conference, but was to multiply a team of teams around where those affinity groups are, the gaps of getting the gospel to every people and place in North America. And so out of that, it sparked this brainstorming and creativity. Been learning a lot from you, Dave, and Bud Houston, our friend Bud, who's down in Dallas, around these three ideas from Gladwell and Tipping Point of, if we're going to see that happen, if we're going to see a team of teams spark, how do we begin to think about, maybe for that example, within Arabs, reaching Arabs, who is the maven? Who's that person within that people group that's going to have the information and the insight needed for where are the entry points? Where are there people already at work doing this? And how do we effectively share the gospel? We need that role, right? In that team. And then who's the connector and who's the persuader that's helping to multiply that? So that was helpful for me, even just thinking through this topic, that that's continuing to roll out in that sphere. How do we not just continue to centralize, but actually distribute that out? And that means that we've got to get innovative around each of those three roles to get to a tipping point in every one of those affinity groups.
Yeah, multiply, 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 multiply. That's the message.
Yep.
Yeah. Great discussion, Mark. I really enjoy just kicking around these ideas with you, especially as we look back in what happened in Oklahoma City, but as we're also restarting in new areas where we're back in the groove, looking for these roles ourselves and trying to be a generalist in practice, but also trying to find people who can help us be specialists on teams and really get effective at continuing to push this idea, exactly what you said, into more and more and more tribes. And I pray that anybody who's listening will get on board and start pushing it into their tribes as well.
If this content has been helpful for you, please take a minute to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. It really helps us to get this content out there farther, to serve Jesus, grow his kingdom, and accomplish the Great Commission until there is no place left. Much love to you guys. See you next time.